weakness of the Covenant League of Nations. Essentially, therefore, the Covenant of the League of Nations was an attempt to achieve peace by associating states within an organization that would oblige them to conform their traditional pursuit of power for security and prestige within forms commonly agreed upon, war remaining an ultimate right. It was not a new union or federal government to which states and peoples would delegate powers for common purposes, starting with the absolute abolition of war. The political organs of the Council and Assembly, that is, new organs of power politics, would henceforth something the international organization in place of judicial organs symbolized by the optional permanent court of international justice. The vision of internationalists, including the Federalists, of a world gradually yet decisively expanding international law and creating new law by world legislation under standards of justice derived from the highest traditions of the civilizations and religions throughout the world, had very little influence. Wilsonianism. Although the Covenant was deeply flawed, the very attempt of President Wilson to bring the United States into the League of Nations was an event of world significance. The national leadership and world statesmanship of Woodrow Wilson mark a new beginning in the history of international organization designed to maintain united world peace. With Wilson, the ideal enters the realm of practical politics. Wilson deserves more credit than any other political philosopher or practicing politician for the actual establishment of the League of Nations. Though due to source of Wilson's own misjudgments, the United States remained outside the League, and though the League proved too weak to stem the course of events leading to World War II, the very establishment of the League of Nations was a break in sovereign national traditions. It was, as Wilson himself said in his last public address, a revolution in received ideas about international relations. Like the state's right of conquest or its internationally legal recourse to war as an instrument of policy, that is, many was more of a triumphal break with the past than the subsequent establishment of the United Nations. If ever humanity unites still more closely in a world federation, that will only be a refinement of the UN, which itself was a modest improvement on this league. Wilson was the great innovator. Wilsonianism, the sum of his international doctrines, remains a source of inspiration or an object of attack for idealists or realists to this day. Wilson delivered at least 10 significant speeches on an association of nations that deserve to be singled out as classics of Wilsonianism, analogous to the works of Kant or Rousseau that we have already noted. In these speeches, Wilson set out his international doctrines with a clarity that has never been equaled. Even President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who brought U.S. participation in a revised league and who quietly guided the official processes leading to the establishment of the United Nations, never spoke so clearly. Grenville Clark, the elder statesman of the Federalist movement, rarely wrote about justice. The only comparable precedent in our have been Robert M. Hutchins, G. A. Borghese, and their colleagues in the University of Chicago's Committee to frame a world constitution from 1945 to 1951. But they were not elected national leaders or statesmen responsible to the public. In his speeches, Wilson emphasized the principles of the sovereignty of the people, self-determination, the interdependence of nations against isolationism, the acceleration of history in the industrial age, the day of conquest and aggrandizement is gone by. He spoke of not a balance of power, but a union of peoples, not equality of nations, but equality of rights, and international cooperation as emerging respect for the rule of world law. For instance, he argued, especially in his last great address in Pueblo, Colorado on 25th September 1919, that the League governments would have to rely on the loyalty, moral forces, and judgment of the people, for armed force was only in the background as a last resort. He also hoped that the International Labor Organization would build solidarity among the workers of the world and undercut the appeal of Bolshevism. He looked forward to a concert of peaceful democratic states, autocracies like the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Turkish empires were replaced by free, as autocracies like the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Turkish empires were replaced by free, self-governing states based on nationality. The era of Communist Party dictatorships, the fascist totalitarianisms, was hardly expected. Ultimately, Wilson implied, the League of Nations itself would become democratic. The world, said Wilson in a famous phrase, with the emphasis on world, must be made safe for democracy. Wilson did speak at great length about even-handed and impartial justice. The last of the ideal objectives of an association of nations that we will discuss here. What did Woodrow Wilson mean by justice? He often used this term to describe whole sects of U.S. war, the large objectives to come out of the Great War. Whole lists of U.S. war. In 1916, it included self-determination, the rights of small nations, and international security. In 1918, it included all the 14 points, introduced as the interest of all peoples of the world in justice and fair dealing. That meant open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, impartial adjustments of colonial claims, the defeat of Germany, settlements in Russia, Belgium, France, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Romania, Serbia, Turkey, and Poland, and finally, a League of Nations to guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of great and small states alike. These objectives were necessary, Wilson said, for this right to prevail. On leaving for the peace conference in Paris, added and something these points of impartial justice, no favorites among states, no special interests favored over the common interest, no economic favoritism, no partial alliances within the League, no secret treaties. Justice then, like right in Wilson's mind, was conceived as the comprehensive objective of the General Association of Nations, without ever quite implying a world state to protect it. Yet justice, as Wilson understood it, was very far from the interests that before and after him were held to be the highest standards for national conduct. A League of Nations to maintain the peace had become a necessity in the modern world. A new order of international relations based not on a balance of power but on a community of power was long overdue. America was in the world, and international organizations were consistent with her ideals: justice, liberation, and succor, as Wilson expressed American ideas in his Metropolitan Opera House address in March 1919, where the great ideals in the vision of the people, these were the large themes of Wilson's international leadership. Whatever tactical compromises he may have had to make, strategically Wilson was very right. The world has not seen his political courage since. That is why world federalisms will always look back to Wilson for inspiration. Federalist ideals were at work among internationalists and behind Wilson's own genius. But neither Wilson nor someone, a senator, nor any European statesman gave the slightest thought to actually establishing a world federal government, empowered to enact law reaching to individuals in order to keep the peace after the Great War. All their energies were expended to break the tradition of isolationism and nationalism that League was actually weak. Even so, it was too much for the Senate, which rejected the covenant without reservations by 53 nays to 38 yeas on 19th of November 1919, and again by a margin of 7 votes on 19th March 1920. The public, too, by the last date, had lost its former enthusiasm. Over 100 years before, Presidents Washington and Jefferson had left office with profound warnings to the citizens of their small republic against entangling alliances with Europe. President Wilson was well aware that this isolationist tradition had long served to preserve and protect the United States. But the republic had grown into a great power, and it was tied by countless threads of industry and commerce to the whole world. When the World War drew the United States into the general disaster, Wilson courageously attempted to show the way to a new tradition of American foreign policy, what is now called internationalism. His arguments were basically that American liberty could no longer be preserved in isolation, that the Republic was founded to make all men free, that America was trusted everywhere and was the hope of the world, that the League of Nations was consistent with American principles, and that failure to lead would have disastrous consequences for America, Europe, and the world. Would U.S. entry into the League of Nations have saved the organization and prevented World War II? Many historians seem to assume so when they portray Wilson's defeat by the Senate in 1919 and again in 1920 as a tragic setback for the United States and ultimately the world. No doubt the participation of the U.S., along with that of Britain, France, Italy, and Japan in the League, would have radically altered world history. One of the Council's greatest concerns at the time, it was deliberating whether to apply sanctions against Italy in 1935, the issue that decided the fate of the League was whether the United States, not a member and hence not bound, as the world's greatest economic and potentially military power, would honor them. But to assume that the main fault with the League was not its structure, but the absence of the United States, is to imply that Article 19 would have led to early revision of the Treaty of Versailles, obviating Germany's grievances. It implies that an effective League would have supplied the need for the provided treaty guarantees with France, 1919, the Treaty of Rapallo, establishing diplomatic relations between Germany and Russia, 1922, and the treaties of Locarno between Germany, Belgium, France, Italy, and Britain, 1925, which seemed to guarantee the something borders and to collectively guard them against aggression by one another. Moreover, this easy assumption implies that the Protocol on the Peaceful Settlement of Disputes, 1924, would have been ratified and have entered into force, that there would have been no occasion for the Anglo-German naval agreement once Hitler embarked on rearmament, 1935, or the Hoare-Laval Agreement on the dismemberment of Ethiopia, 1935, or the capitulation of Munich, 1938, or the Hitler-Stalin Non-Aggression Pact, 1939. All this is too much to hope for. Judging by the strength of sovereign and military traditions, even with the United States as a member, the League of Nations by all would still have failed, as the United Nations, its successor built on the same principles of sovereign equality, did by the end of 1946. But then, if a Second World War had still come, it could not have been claimed at the end of it, as in 1945, that the reason why the League failed was that the United States had refused to join. The weaknesses of a League of sovereign states would have been much more evident to all, and hence the arguments of the internationalists and the federalists for a much stronger world organization based on justice and law, even a constitutionally formed world federal government might, as humanity's second chance, have prevailed. Man's coming of age, the probable struggle for unification of the world into one community of knowledge and will, The Outline of History by H.G. Wells, The Shape of Things to Come by H.G. Wells. By the 1930s, after a decade of historic deterioration, the League of Nations began to fail in keeping the peace. In principle, the reason was that the League, by the terms of its covenant, did not limit the sovereign independence of its members. When the League protested the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Japan withdrew from the League and contentiously proceeded to incorporate conquered Manchuria into her imperial domains. This war, founded in the decade by futile League against Italian aggression in Ethiopia in 1935, German reoccupation of the Rhineland in defiance of the Versailles Treaty in 1936, and intervention by fascist and democratic great powers in the Spanish Civil War in 1936 to 39. The British settlement with Nazi Germany over Czechoslovakia in Munich in 1938 for peace with hardly any respect for the League. The Munich settlement then was taken as the occasion for further German aggression against Poland, which in turn unloosed the Second World War. Against this background of failure, new voices began to be raised in promotion of world government. H.G. Wells wrote Man's Coming of Age, The Probable Struggle for the Unification of the World into One Community of Knowledge and Will, as an added chapter, number 41, to The Outline of History, and subsequently wrote the book The Shape of Things to Come, regarded as an original book of the movement. As a result, Wellesian societies sprung up in various parts of the world, but their inaction for the press, the new epithet utopian, earned for them from the press the new epithet utopian, that is, one who wills the end but not the means. Union Now by Clarence Street was published in 1939. Street had for years covered the activities of the League of Nations as a New York Times correspondent. Seized by a sense of urgency to stop the rise of Hitler, returned to the U.S. in November 1938 with the manuscript which Harper's had promised to publish by the next March. The review of a professor of political science of Oberlin College attributed to the realistic analysis of a Hamilton with the exuberant vision of a Walt Whitman. Street proposed a union of 15 nations like that of the 13 states of the United States in 1787. He suggested that the union be granted maximal powers to promote or to provide for common rights, defense, regulation of interstate commerce, union money, and uniform postal, transportation, and communication systems. The former something of the to be united, he listed as, I think it's former democracies, as the United States, or the founder democracies, to be listed as United States, the British Commonwealth, including the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Union of South Africa and Ireland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. These democracies, if united, would acquire a preponderance of force for in excess of the military forces of the fascist states, and they would deter war. But such a union of peoples was not an easy accomplishment in 1939. Street was most forceful in which he reminded his readers that the modern democracies were established to secure the rights of the people, especially liberty, through the operation of laws that regard all people as equals. The sovereignty of the state was created by the sovereign people only as a means to protect their individual freedom. State sovereignty was not absolute in the beginning, but the history of the Atlantic democracies by 1939 indicated to Street that they had fallen into the same heresy of absolute national sovereignty as had the 13 states under the League of Friendship, in parentheses, Articles of Confederation, before establishment of the U.S. Constitution. If the peoples of the Atlantic could cease sacrificing needlessly our individual freedom to the freedom of our nations, be true to our democratic philosophy, and establish that, quote, more perfect union toward which all our existing unions explicitly or implicitly aligned, they could unite. Are not liberty and union now and forever one and inseparable, as in Webster's day? Street asked. Street himself saw the advantages of union in the positive terms of increasing individual liberty, reducing the expense and artificial impediments of duplicate national governments, giving scope to individual enterprise and creative ability in a greater, more united civilization. Then he concluded broadly, man's vast future would begin. Street argued that union would prevent war first by example and then by overwhelming social, economic, and military force. He thought that the citizens of Germany or Italy or Japan, to attain the equality they crave, would see how needless was the sacrifice of their freedom to their nation's military power, overthrow their autocrats, establish democracies at home, and bring their nations into the Great Republic. In the interim, to deter them from following their autocrats in making war on democracies, to bring about a new order based on state supremacy, the Democratic Union would present an insuperable preponderance of power. Street was quite explicit about this and referred to it again and again. If ever a book made a movement, Union Now was such a book. It was through 7 editions by 1949. The New York and London editions of March 1939, a French translation, Union au Chaos, in June 1939, a Swedish translation, and then, after the war broke out, U.S. editions of 1940, 1941, 1943, and 1949. Street estimated, on publication of his 8th edition in 1961, that over 250,000 copies had been sold. Street's ideas led directly to the founding of his own organization, Federal Union. In Britain, his book supported the organization with the same name, Federal Union. Through the British had independent founding following the Munich crisis. Street inspired Grenville Clark to write his first draft of a minimal world constitution in December 1939. Union Now committees and committees of correspondence, hearkening to those of Samuel Otis, sprang up in the United States and Europe. A number of prominent Americans, including John Foster Dulles, Robert Sherwood, and William Allen White, and in 1941 signed an appeal in favor of a stable system of international relationship which not periodically break down into worldwide war, adding a favorable reference to Street's plan. Later in 1941, a split in Federal Union over partial versus universal federation led to the formation of World Federalists, who brought a populist line into United World Federalists in 1947. In 1941, according to legend, apparently true, Harris Wofford, while doing his Latin lesson in the Bath House, heard Street give a speech on the radio, and Harris was so inspired he founded Student Federalists. In the same year, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Owen J. Roberts became an ardent advocate of union with the democracies, and he never wavered from that position for the rest of his life. Street's following decline through the war and the Pittsburgh Conception of November 1945, Pittsburgh Convention of November 1945, after Hiroshima, Federal Union all but disbanded to permit the Universalists to form their own way in other world government organizations, to find their own way in other world federal government organizations. Street became editor of the journal that continued to express his views, federation, and union. The Universalists eventually formed United World Federalists. Then, after the Cold War had begun, and after the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in April of 1949, Roberts and former Undersecretary of State Will Clayton formed the Atlantic Union Committee, AUC, which introduced legislation rivaling that of United World Federalists in Congress. Street re-edited Union Now in 1949 so that Russia emerged in place of the axis of the autocracy against which the Union was aimed. The Universalists saw such a partial union as a vital threat to the Soviet Union, liable to precipitate the very war that world government was intended to prevent. It be said that United World Federalists' whole political accomplishment was the defeat of the AUC legislation at the cost of its own program. Throughout the 1950s, however, the Street group remained a kind of gadfly on the right. And in 1960, they succeeded in getting passed by Congress and signed by President Dwight Eisenhower, authorizing a United States Citizens Commission on NATO to hold a convention of citizens of the North Atlantic democracies to explore and recommend how they might better unite their peoples. In 1972, this Atlantic Union resolution actually passed in the Senate after 23 years of efforts, which though failed in the House, while the public was preoccupied with the Vietnam War and the landslide for Richard Nixon. Throughout the years, Street tested many leaders for the qualities necessary to lead Atlantic Federation. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Reynold, Harry Truman, Dean Acheson, George Marshall, John Foster Dulles, Estes Grafenau, Dwight Eisenhower, Paul Henry Speake, Richard Nixon, Robert Schuman, John F. Kennedy, George Herbert Humphrey, Charles de Gaulle, Christian Hertier, William Fulbright, Rockefeller, Eugene McCartney, Robert Kennedy, and Paul Finley. His journals remain replete with the record of high-level contacts on a practical policy toward Atlantic Federation. He died in 1986. World Federalists in 1941, shortly before Pearl Harbor and U.S. entry into the war, the Street organization split over the issue of partial versus universal federation as a peace proposal and soon enough as a war aim. The splinter group, led by Vernon Nash, Mike Blake, and Tom Gressler, became World Federalists. By 1947, were to contribute the largest and most active membership organization to the United World Federalists. Street's group, Federal Union, through the center of much press attention, slowly declined in numbers. Historical sketch. Vernon Nash, World War I veteran, Rhodes Scholar, journalist with 12 years' experience in China. Millard Blake, Quaker, advertising writer for Young and Rubicam. Tom Otto, emigre from Nazi Germany, lawyer in New York. Union Now had hardly appeared in the bookshops when the group was stirred into action. Blake's story, we were all reading of words of Street and said, what can be done about this? What can be do for you? And I don't know whether he would have done anything about it himself. He was the kind who carried his mail around in his Fraser Potts, a broker on Wall Street, kept after Street with finally Street agreed to come to a meeting of Potts' apartment on 7th of March 1939. 14 people were present, mostly strangers to one another, but united in the belief that it now become a practical possibility to make an effective start towards effective world government. There was already a division beginning between the members and Street, for the title of their original organization was Committee of Correspondence for World Federal Union, but the goal of their program statement, more narrowly, to bring about union now of the United States of America and other democracies.